This is Chapter 14, Notes Part 2. So Chapter 14 is all about macroevolution, big-scale changes that result in the formation of new species or the death, aka extinction, of an entire species. So speciation is the formation of a new species. This occurs when two populations can no longer mate. So all of those pre- and post-zygotic barriers that we went over earlier, those are all ways where a single population might end up splitting into two or more separate populations, and thus the genes in those populations might become so different. So as they acquire traits that are beneficial for their individual environments, those populations might become so different that they can no longer breed, and I would then classify them to be two separate species, and I would call that speciation. The two populations can no longer breed. In order for that to happen, there has to be variation in the population, meaning DNA differences in the gene pool, selection, where some individual traits are favored and some are selected against, and then isolation, any of those criteria that keep the species separate. So shown here in the diagram is an example of this. There was a common ancestor, some cat species that lived long ago. Generally, the common ancestors are not animals that are still alive today. They're ancient, extinct species. But within that population, there was variation. Some of the DNA caused the cats to look, in this case, smaller and light brown, or a little bit bigger and yellow, bigger and dark brown, or medium size and black. So within that population, there was variation where not all of the cats looked the same. These populations then may have adapted to their individual environments. So there was some type of isolation that ended up preventing them from breeding with one another. Maybe they had behavioral rituals that each other didn't necessarily prefer. Or maybe they also tended to kind of hang out in different parts of the grasslands or wherever they lived. But for some reason, there was gene flow block, meaning that these populations did not mix their DNA. Within those individual habitats and within those individual zones, they then acquired traits that were best for the particular habitat that they were living in. Now, those organisms are so different that they can no longer breed. However, they all are related because they all came from the ancestral population. So this is an example of speciation where one species ended up splitting into four separate species. This can occur very easily when there is a geographic separation, like that Grand Canyon example I gave in the previous video, where there is a physical separation that blocks the organisms from mating. Another example of this is this Isthmus of Panama, which formed 3.5 billion years ago. So before there was no land connection, and the seas, the Caribbean Sea and the Pacific Ocean, were connected, so fish could easily swim back and forth. But a very slow process millions of years ago ended up forming this land bridge, where now there is land between the Caribbean Sea and the Pacific Ocean, such that the fish can no longer freely swim. So I have a population of fish on one side. It became isolated from the population on the other side. So these fish now have acquired traits through evolution. A long period of time they have acquired traits, and now those fish are so different that even if they were thrown into a tank together, they would no longer be able to breed. So that is speciation, and it is speciation based on a geographic separation. We call that allopatric speciation. There is a physical separation. You guys have heard of continental drift. Continental drift is the idea that planet Earth is made of these giant tectonic plates, and these tectonic plates are shifting slowly over time. Due to these shifts, we see a lot of geologic changes, like we see formation of volcanoes and mountain ranges. We see formations of ridges, which is basically like a trench or like a big valley. We also see that entire continents are pushed together or pushed apart. So continental drift allows allopatric speciation to occur because geographic locations are constantly changing. You guys have also heard of Pangea, the idea that it's believed long ago all of the continents were connected as one. And so if we had, let's say, our cat species and it was living, somewhere here, and it was living and freely roaming around, when those plates shifted, there's now a huge ocean between them. So we have split the population into two separate groups. And those two separate groups, those two separate new populations evolved separately and now have become so different that they can no longer breed. This is also called geographic isolation, habitat isolation, allopatric speciation. They're all very related, kind of for our purpose, they're pretty much all the same. The idea that there's a physical separation. However, there doesn't always have to be a physical separation. Sim means same, so sympatric speciation occurs when the organisms are in the same geographic location, but then something prevents them from breeding within that same location. So for example, maybe with these pine trees, some of the pine trees start to release pollen at different times of the year than other pine trees. That then is potentially going to cause breeding at different times of the year. And even though all the pine trees are in the same location, we start to have this separation where some of them are reproducing earlier in the year than others. Another example would be maybe if you think about like a lake, like Lake Michigan, and let's say there's a population of trout in the lake. And some of the trout like to hang out near the surface of the lake because they like to eat the food and the algae that's up there at the surface. Other trout like to hang out at the bottom of the lake because they just like the taste of the food that's down there better. Well, when they go to find a mate, they're probably going to find a mate who's in the same portion of the lake as them. So these fish at the top might mate with each other. These fish at the bottom might mate with each other. And after many, many generations, hundreds or thousands of years, we might see that there is a separation in species in the fish that hang out towards the top of the lake, the trout that hang out at the top, and the trout that hang out at the bottom. There is no combination of their gene pool because they're not breeding with each other, just solely based on preference and where they like to hang out. It's not as though a trout could not possibly swim to the higher or lower zone. They could. It's just that they're choosing not to. So there is no physical separation, but for some preference reason or timing reason, organisms start to mate only with a subset or a small group of the population. Hybrid zones are the idea that sometimes the line between two species is not really black and white, and there are occasionally these areas where hybrid organisms can breed. An example of this is the wolf and coyote, where there is a wolf population in one area and a coyote population in another area, and there is a small zone over which those organisms breed, and create these hybrid organisms. So it's not 100% block in gene flow. There's not a lot of these examples. It's just kind of a small offshoot example that it can sometimes occur. A little bit more on speciation. Formation of a species can occur really fast. Adaptive radiation is the idea that a whole lot of species stem from one original species in a very short period of time. An example of this is when all of the dinosaurs went extinct. In terms of geology, that happened in a relatively short period of time. When the dinosaurs were around, there were mammals, rodents, and rats, mice, squirrel type things like that. But they were forced by pressure to somewhat remain small because they had to avoid these huge, massive dinosaur predators, and they tended to kind of all be somewhat camouflage. But when suddenly, boom, all the dinos go extinct, there's a whole lot of opportunity for now that species to look different. So this is like adaptive radiation is like a massive boom where there's all these new opportunities for organisms to look different. The example on the left shows a founder species that is a bird that came to a group of islands off South America, the Galapagos Island. And that founder species ended up branching off into many different species, some of which could eat different types of food. So there's the arrival of a bird species on an island, an abundance of food, great climate, great environment, not a lot of big predators. So we have this massive explosion in different organisms. Adaptive radiation tends to occur when there's a whole lot of resources available and a lot of different organisms have a chance to survive, and when there's not a lot of natural selection, so like not a lot of top predators. To conclude, speciation can occur slowly or rapidly. Adaptive radiation is rapid. These are classified into two groups, gradualism and punctuated equilibrium. Gradualism is the idea that small changes accumulate over time. Gradualism is not really believed to hold true in most cases. In most cases, we see more of a sudden change in the fossil record. We don't see organisms slowly changing over time, but rather something in the environment changes and the organisms either survive or die. And those who survive tended to look different than maybe the majority looked originally. So this is just saying that the fossil record doesn't really agree with gradualism. Punctuated equilibrium is the idea that things tend to stay the same, relatively the same, for a long period of time until there is a massive boom and a massive change. Punctuated equilibrium more so aligns with the evidence that we see in the fossil record. So gradualism and punctuated equilibrium are just two theories about the speed at which evolution occurs. So just to kind of conclude, evolution is not goal-oriented. We're not making perfect species over time. Species change based on the environment that they're in. Those with favorable traits survive. Those with unfavorable traits tend to die. This one I think is super important. We're constantly learning. With new technology, think about how DNA has only been really known for like 60 years. And real DNA technology has only come to be in the last 20-ish years. So we are constantly learning and changing our ideas about what we believe to be true. What we say is true today, you might realize in your lifetime gets disproven, which is kind of crazy. But as we learn new things, we have to continually revise our ideas. And then also this one I mentioned in the previous video, but organisms don't adapt to survive. They either have the traits that allow them to survive or they don't and they die. No organism is changing its DNA. No organism is being forced to change based on what's happening around it. It's just, do they have the traits to survive, or are they going to die? That's the conclusion of 14.